A nation is a people's collective or common language, history, society, and those characteristics that can help bind and hold them together. This has become the foundation of many modern nation states as they define the self-sovereignty of the nation and the directions they're moving forward and what their priority and goals are as that nation. But for Ukraine, they've had difficulty in this, in that multiple Russian-centric empires or nations have tried to deliberately suppress their own national identity and supplant a Russian identity on top of them. Still now, many Russians refer to Ukrainian as Little Russians and Russia as Big Russians. Ukraine suffered under the USSR, where their own national identity was heavily suppressed in favor of a more Russian-centric one. And they struggled with this. A lot of their leadership was killed, their culture was suppressed, and just general and they could not really recover from this easily. Even in independence, they could not reform their national identity easily. While other nations were able to quickly recover, or at least somewhat quickly recover from the USSR, they struggled with this for much longer. But recently, there has been a resurgence after multiple mass movements in the Ukrainian national identity. To see this all, we must first see the Russian suppression. In 1917 was the first instance of a Ukrainian state. This was in the Ukrainian War of Independence, but this was short-lived, as they ended up losing their own War of Independence, which was also the Russian Civil War, and the Bolsheviks won and created the USSR, with Ukraine as a Soviet Socialist Republic. The most notable period for Ukraine in this was in the early 1930s, and what happened is known as the Holodomor. This was an artificial famine caused by the USSR through three main policies. They first collectivized farming, they then mandated quotas on that farming, but sent the results to other European nations and trying to create funds. And the third was they deliberately purged the Ukrainian leadership and replaced it with Russians. They also moved Russians into the western and southern part of the country to work on these farms, while the center and west of the country died off massively from starvation. This was in a deliberate effort to try to smother the Ukrainian identity. This was not happening in other parts of the USSR, as Estonian culture and identity was faring just fine. During the Soviet period, the Estonian Song and Dance Festival was allowed to continue, and it saw its largest growth during this time. All the same songs and music was played from the festival, with the one minor addition of the state anthem. Other than that, they were allowed to keep their culture and identity, and this ended up benefiting them in independence, where they were able to quickly recover and form their own self. This was not the case in Ukraine. There was a deliberate effort to try to supplant Russian onto them. Once Ukraine gained independence, they struggled in throwing this off of them. Even after 10 years, Dr. Igor Tobak found that 80% of Ukraine's leadership was still from the old Soviet cadre. And this leadership was not interested too much in the good of the Ukrainian people. A lot of it was corrupt and siphoned funds from the state to themselves. And one of the reasons that they stayed this way was that Ukrainians, the older generation who lived under the Soviet regime, was not too resistant. From de Tocqueville's discoveries in America in his examination of American democracy, he saw that a key part of a people's identity is that the common people must be willing to group together and understand their own weakness, and that together as a group they are stronger to then throw off tyranny. But that was not the case for these older Ukrainian generations who grew up under the Soviet rule. Because of this corruption, Ukraine struggled to grow in the same way as some of its other post-Soviet neighbors. Poland was able to see much greater economic growth than it was. However, this did change over time gradually as the younger generations grew up and saw more Western countries and what was happening there. And over two large mass movements, they worked towards rebuilding a new Ukrainian national identity. These movements were the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity, or Euromaidan movement. they were heavily focused on more Western ideals and moving away from Russia. The Euromaidan movement in particular focused on getting Ukrainian policy to be closer in line with the EU and other European nations. However, Russia was not a fan of this, as they wished to keep Ukraine within their influence, and as such invaded and annexed Crimea, the southern peninsula of Ukraine, and funded separatists in the Donbass region to try to throw off Ukrainians and show them that they were still firmly within themselves. So in order to try to resist this Russian influence, Ukrainians must band together with some of the Western nations and use their power together as a group to throw off Russian influence. Now, one of the two major alliances that Ukraine could join to do this would be the European Union. This is a complex political and economic alliance that would require Ukraine to make many reforms throughout its government and policy in order to more closely align with the European Union. This would take years and is a very complicated and long process. The Union has many different parts and sections of it, where they might exclude some parts but follow others. So a simpler solution that could deal with Russian military aggression would be NATO. NATO is a purely military alliance that is much simpler and easier to join. It requires only military reforms that since 2014 Ukraine has already done many of. So joining NATO would be much easier for Ukraine to do. However, NATO does not allow membership to countries with active conflicts within their borders, which Ukraine currently does have with the war in the Donbass region. And since they still do not recognize the occupation of Crimea, that also counts to preventing NATO membership. But when you're asking for this country to join these two large international agreements, you must also see what the people want. And for many of the people, this is a difficult question. The younger new national identity is still growing. While the majority of the country sees itself as patriots of Ukraine and that they are Ukrainians, they are not too proud and do not really believe in their country's ability to fight and really protect itself. That's rather low, but it's still higher in the western and central regions of Ukraine, where this national identity is stronger. In the more still Russian-aligned eastern and south of the country, it's not quite so. When asked about the EU, most Ukrainians do not think that their nation could form around it as a national idea, but the majority say that they would join NATO. In order to throw off Russian influence, Ukraine has to be able to join one of these other alliances that could either protect it from Russia's indirect influence economically and politically, or Russia's direct military influence. But the formation of these still heavily requires a consensus among the Ukrainian people as this grows.
All right on time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. To oral defense.
Oh, right.
That's okay.
Thought.
I know.
Oh, this part's gonna be easy.
Take a breather. Okay. So my first question for you is, how did some preliminary information that you gather guide your research question?
So a lot of my preliminary information was focused around the general history of Ukraine. That way I could focus on what parts of it influence Ukrainian identity the most. And from this preliminary search of Ukraine's history, I figured that while Ukraine's national identity had built up considerably in a few hundred years past, during the Soviet period, a lot of suppression really removed that, and it wasn't as relevant for when talking about the Russian influence, because the Russian influence largely undid the build-up beforehand. So starting at the USSR period was acceptable.
Okay. All right, last question for you. What are the implications of your findings to your community?
So one of the things about my findings is the link between a people's willingness to fight and their actual ability to come together. In battling corruption, a lot of people try government reforms and getting some other international agencies to come in and try to deal with it. But a really powerful thing has to be the people's willingness to. One of the things I saw was that even after independence, many Ukrainians were just not willing to really fight back and come together to try to get rid of the corruption. But as they built up these movements and the national identity, they were able to get rid of a lot of this corruption. So for when dealing with other countries who have corruption issues, focus should be placed on trying to raise an identity within the people and trying to get the people to do something by themselves.
Okie dokie. All right, excellent job.